As Daryl said, I had the great gig in Florida. Kind of like, some of you are old enough to remember Charles Kuralt. Do you remember him from CBS? Well, I had the Charles Kuralt job, though I'm sure not anywhere near as much money. But I traveled from Pensacola to Key West for close to 4 decades. My editor would tell me, just find me something interesting. And that's what I did. And so I went to some of the most beautiful areas, met some of the most interesting people while I wrote about what I call real Florida. And that included everything from food, art, music. I'm going to talk about some of the interesting people that I got to know over a pretty long period. Sometimes I just met them, but most of the time I wrote about them. And before I start, I should tell you that Florida has always been a place for people to get new starts. It's a place of new beginnings. I'm sure that's true for a number of you who, it could have been you just got tired of shoveling snow. It could have been that simple. Or, you know, a job or a family, whatever. But you came here and with hopes that things were going to be better. And in Florida, that tradition goes back to 1513. A guy named Ponce de Leon, who was the governor of Puerto Rico. And he did some traveling, and when he got back to Puerto Rico, he'd found he'd been deposed. He'd lost his job. So he sailed back to Spain, and he went to see Ferdinand and said, hey, what happened? I want my job back. King Ferdinand said, nope. However, go back to Puerto Rico and then sail west. And if you discover something that's worthy, I'll give you half. So in spring of 2013, he came to what he thought was an island. It was La Florida, and somewhere between Melbourne and the Florida border. So he was one, and we could just go on. William Bartram, King George III's, or William Bartram was the son of John Bartram, who was King George III's botanist. And William was a disappointment to his dad. Never married, couldn't run a business. He just liked to draw pictures. In 1773, got this gig, go through the South and make an inventory of people, the flora and the fauna. And he did that. And it's been in print since 1791. It's still a very interesting book, especially the Florida stuff. And then we could talk about Harriet Beecher Stowe, who wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin. She was the most popular writer of her day in the United States. She got a little tired of the celebrity. She started to come into the St. Johns River region in the 1870s. And she came every winter, and she started writing magazine stories about Florida, telling people, come on down, come on. And she liked the oranges and some of the same things we still like. So, you know, when you're on US 27 in the winter and it's crowded, you could blame Harriet Beecher Stowe. Marjorie Kinnan Rawlings, another one, came down to Florida in 1928. Thinking she was going to write Gothic romances. She never published one, but she wrote The Yearling, won a Pulitzer Prize. And I'm going to introduce you to my parents, who, while they weren't Bartram or Marjorie Kinnan Rawlings, they came to Florida in 1951 with high hopes of starting over. During the war, or before the war, my dad was a musician, a piano player. After he got back from overseas, he decided Florida was going to be the place to live. And so they came down here. That's the house we lived in Miami. That's how a lot of houses look like that in Florida. They were little bungalows. And think about the people who moved to Florida about then. Only rich people had air conditioning. And my parents moved in June, and rainy season had commenced. It couldn't have been more humid. My mother lived in fear of going into the kitchen and turning on the lights for fear of what she might see. She would say to my dad, "Ernie, what have you done to me?" My dad was Ernie, my mother was Bee. They had names that should have put them on Sesame Street, I have to tell you. So there was my mother, femme fatale. She was very attractive, and even when she was well into her 80s and living in a assisted living, she was sure that every man was in love with her. Well, I never told her otherwise. My mother hated Florida for all of her life. Never left though. But she gave me a gift, and that was the gift of being nosy, of being curious, of being able to tell a story. Beatrice Mary Grace O'Donnell, Klinkenberg, is my mom. She had all the virtues and all the well-known vices of some people who are Irish. But when I was a kid, she'd get up, she would have her cup of coffee and her grapefruit for breakfast. Everybody had a half a grapefruit for breakfast then. And she'd walk down the street, her hair in bobby pins, a Pall Mall kind of sticking out of her lip, tough Irish broad. And she'd come in an hour later with that cigarette. And she'd look for that grapefruit. That was her ashtray now that she'd eaten. And she'd say, "All right, let me tell you what I found out." And she'd dish on all those neighbors. So, God, I got that from her, being curious about everybody, everything. My mother was one of those people who thought everybody had a story to tell, and I was too. I thought everyone had a story to tell. So that was her gift. So there's my dad, the piano player. That's Key West, 1954. We lived there that summer. He played at some nightclub. I can't tell. There's a little ID thing in the left, but it just has the name of the photographer. I wish. I know some of the places in Key West where we stayed and where we went, but I'd love to know if that bar is still there. My dad loved everything about Florida, especially fishing. So there I am. I'm a little boy there, and I've got my little $2 binoculars and my little shorts with flamingos on them. And I'm going to choose this moment to tell you something because I'm at Beacon College. Now, my mother never went to high school, or she didn't graduate from high school. My dad graduated, but they were working people, and they didn't have the education or the information to know that there might be something wrong with me. I could not pay attention. And man, did I give the nuns at St. Rose of Lima a run for their money. I tell people I invented the rope-a-dope. Do you remember that thing that Ali had to use to avoid getting punched? And to this day, I'm much better at focusing now, but I still have problems with numbers. I transpose them. I have to focus if I write somebody's phone number down, because I'll get it wrong. And only, when I grew up did I learn that, hey, I wasn't stupid. I just had something wrong with me. So I salute Beacon College for helping people who are more challenged or just as challenged achieve maybe an easier way than it is for people who don't know about Beacon College. So anyway, there I am. So there's my dad and I down in the Keys with a stringer of snapper, and that's how I imprinted on Florida, through fishing. I started teaching myself every fish you could catch in Florida. And when we were back in Miami, my dad used to like to do these open water swims in the afternoon. And when I was old enough, I had a little mask and a snorkel, and I'd hang onto his trunks. And he'd swim a mile between the piers. It was like being in an aquarium. The water was so clear. And you could see the snapper and the pompano. And we'd swim through these big schools of mullet. And it never occurred to us that there might be sharks on the other side, but ignorance was bliss. So my dad gave me the gift of natural Florida. And from there, I wrote my first book, Davy Crockett and the Alligators. Only one copy in print. My mother, of course, saved it. I was the newspaper editor of the Tampa Times on my block, Circulation 2. It was hard to, I was doing it in longhand, so I'd do one and then think, well, I need to, if I want to collect 3 cents a piece, I'm going to have to do, if I want to get up to 6 cents, I'm going to have to do another copy. So I did. So, anyway. So, when I was a kid, everybody, and then when I was a little older than that, everybody in Miami had heard about Marjorie Stoneman Douglas. Here's her story. She was born in 1890. She was from New England. She moved to Miami in 1915 after her divorce to work for her daddy's newspaper, the Miami Herald. Her dad said, okay, I'm going to put you on the women's pages. And she said, no, father. She was kind of formal. She was a little imperious. I can report just as well as any man. So, okay. So she was, before most of us had heard the word feminist, that's what she was. And she was really good. She was a very good newspaper reporter, and pretty soon she was writing fiction, and she was writing for magazines. And in 1941, she got a call from an editor of a new book series. It was called The Rivers of America. This editor was hiring prominent writers all over the country to write about our rivers. Not only the natural history, but the human history. And he wanted Marjorie Stoneman Douglas to write about the Miami River. And she said, what? It's like this, it's like an inch long. How about I write about the Everglades? And he said, oh, well, madam, the Everglades is not a river. And she said, well, I have to tell you it is. It's 60 miles wide, and it's 6 inches deep, but it flows from the Orlando area down to Florida Bay. It's a river. So she wrote that book. It published in 1947, Everglades River of Grass. Here she is, and look at, this is her book signing at Burdines. Burdines was the Florida store. It's gone now. This is the Burdines that we shopped at in Miami when I was a boy. She's 50, I think she's 58 years old at this point, 1948. I mean, she could retire, she's done a lot. She'd been a newspaper reporter, a magazine reporter. She wanted to work for the garden club. She wanted to have some fun. But in 1978, so we're talking about 58, 60, so we're talking about 30 years later, so she's in her late 70s, right? Okay, so it's 68 then. I told you I had trouble with numbers. So someone had this plan to build this international airport on the Everglades, and she formed an organization called the Friends of the Everglades and stopped it. She was a ferocious environmentalist. So I started to correspond with her in the 1980s. And I would send her my environmental stories, especially about stories about the Everglades, because I was an Everglades boy. Fishing, catching snakes, all the things that Florida boys, and a few Florida girls did, but mostly boys. In fact, I tell people I was the founder of the Boys Without Dates Club. Between the smell of fish on my hands and the knowledge that this idiot boy is catching snakes, It just meant that dates were going to be hard to come by, right? By the way, my wife was in an audience one time, and I talked about being a boy without a date, and afterwards she came up to me and she said, "Don't tell people you were the founder of the Boys Without Dates. It makes me look hard up." So I know many of you will never see her. So I feel safe in telling you that story tonight, right? So anyway, I was corresponding with Mrs. Douglas, and then in about 1992, she's 100 years old, right? She's 102, in fact. I decided to do a series of essays about the Everglades, taking as a model Life on the Mississippi by Mark Twain. And I was going to start in the Kissimmee Valley, work my way south, writing about the people, the place, and the issues. And I decided, you know what, I think the first one should be a full-blown reported essay about Marjorie Stoneman Douglas. So I went down there. And she opened the door. She was about this tall by then. In a bathrobe, pearl. She always wore pearls. And I thought I'd have an hour with her because she's 102, if that, you know. She was very, very deaf. She had macular degeneration. She could hardly see. She sat on the couch. I sat on the chair. She had an aide who sat next to her. And I would ask her a question, and the aide would shout it in her ear. Pretty soon I was shouting at the aide. I didn't mean to do that. Well, we had a great time. She spoke in perfect paragraphs at the age of 102. And she, I don't know, she just had this authority. And there was a little bit of a fury to her, you know, because she'd seen a lot in her time. She'd seen a lot of corruption, venality, whatever. I thought I was going to impress her by giving her my Everglades creds, you know. So I had just been on a Florida Panther capture, and I decided to tell her about it, what it was like, because I knew she'd seen a Florida Panther in 1923 in Naples. And so I started to tell her, they're catching these panthers, they're putting radio collars on them and then releasing them. And then they can tell how panthers move. And she looks at me and she says in this imperious way, she says, "Wow, that sounds like the utmost cruelty." And I said, "Oh, well, you know, Mrs. Douglas, they're doing it because," she said, "my cat Willie doesn't even like a flea collar." So I thought, oh my God, I'm with a cat woman, you know. There's no talking to a cat woman. She had cat doors in her house, and she had strays coming in, you know. And I tried one more time and said, "Lord have mercy." She was with the, you know, the idiot. So she stopped. I stopped at that point. But what a day it was. And I sent her every one of those stories. She always answered through a secretary. But she would sign it, this kind of, you know, she couldn't see, but I still have those things, and they mean a lot to me to have them. She died when she was 108 years old. The last couple of years she mostly slept, but there were probably 2 or 3 years after we spoke that we corresponded. And it was a wonderful thing. And I'd like to talk to her a little bit now because her name is in the news now. Florida, you know, one of the things about Florida is history is what happened 2 years ago or 3 years ago. And with the murder of high school students at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School last year about this time, I thought it was a time to sort of resurrect Marjorie. Initially, I mean, we all focused on the murders. That was what was important. But as weeks went by, I began to realize, God, you know, they never say who she was. And so I actually, a couple magazines, excuse me, republished an essay I'd written about her when she passed. And then Washington Post decided to to do a profile of her and called me, and I contributed to that. A lot of people say, oh my God, she would be spitting in her grave at what happened. And it's true, she was. But I tell people, she also would have been invigorated by these young students who in their innocence, they didn't know that the powers that be were not going to do any kind of gun safety stuff. But she would have just loved them because they're going to keep on trying. So anyway, Marjorie Stoneman Douglas. The Highwaymen. Anybody know who I'm talking about? These are painters, right? In the 1950s in Fort Pierce on the East Coast, at a time when African American people didn't, if you were an African American, a man, you were probably going to pick oranges. If you were a woman, you were going to work as a laundress or a maid or maybe watch somebody's kids. Segregated Florida. Schools for blacks and schools for whites. And there was this high school called Lincoln Academy that was a black school. Had a teacher named Zenobia Jefferson, who I got to know in the 90s. She had a prize student named Alfred Hair. She had taught him everything she could. And she wanted to teach him more, but she knew she was going to have to find a mentor. And she found this guy named A.E. Bean Backus, who was the dean of Florida landscape painting. He lived in Fort Pierce. She sent Alfred Hair to Backus, and he started to mentor him. And he told Hair, I sell my paintings for $350. That was a lot of money in 1954. You can't get that kind of money, but you could do 10 paintings for $35 each, and you could get that money. So Alfred started to do that. And you have to remember, again, this is the time when a lot of people like my dad are moving to Florida, and these banks are going up and motels going up, and they're looking for inexpensive things to hang on the wall. And Hair did not see himself really as an artist. He saw himself as somebody who was going to make some money and not have to pick oranges. Pretty soon he could not keep up with the demand, and so he started to recruit his friends, and he started to give his friends painting lessons. And eventually there were 26 of them, including one woman, who were doing these relatively quick paintings, and they later became known as the Highwaymen because they would go up and down US 1, US 27, and US 19 on the West Coast, and often sell their paintings on street corners, or even better, go into banks or motels and sell their paintings. Hair was Alfred Hair, this young man who started it, always said he wanted to be a millionaire and he wanted to own a Cadillac. He got the Cadillac, he was murdered over a woman and didn't become a millionaire. And then that whole Highwayman movement kind of waned out until the 90s when a guy named Jim Fitch of Sebring, amateur anthropologist, heard about them and started to collecting their paintings, sometimes going into a thrift store and buying them for $1 each. $20, $15, $25 would be a really good one. And I found out about them, and so I started going to Fort Pierce with Fitch. And initially we could not find a painter who would talk to us. As far as most painters were concerned, these African American painters, we could be working for the IRS, whatever. So it took a while. And so we started to make some inroads finally. So this is a Highwayman painting. This is by a guy named Harold Newton, considered one of the best. If you've seen a bunch of these paintings, they start to look, you can identify them quickly. And here's the beauty of it. These painters were so prolific. You could go to a garage sale this weekend and you could find them. Some of the antique stores. What's the community down the road with all the what?
Mount Dora.
Mount Dora. I mean, I've seen him in Mount Dora. But they like to do river scenes from the Indian River. That's what that is. This is Harold Newton's brother, Sam Newton, who's still alive. Harold's dead. That's the Everglades. And if you were at Fort Pierce and you went west, the Everglades were right there. When I see this painting, man, it just feels like home to me. They like to do seashores. This is by Livingston Roberts, who he passed too. But this was a rather big painting. This was probably a $35 painting. They didn't like to use a lot of paint, so they would try to make do with some muted colors. They made all their frames. Often their material was kind of a construction board. It was all about keeping things cheap and painting quickly. The first guy I wrote about was a guy named Al Block. He had stopped painting. He was living in a crack house. And Jim Fitch and I drove up to the crack house. And Fitch was this guy who wore a bow tie, and he sounded like Ross Perot. And he stepped out of my truck and said, "Is that Black Hair?" And Black came out and got in my truck. And we took him for a meal. He was pitiful. He'd stopped painting. He was addicted. He was begging for money. We couldn't do that, but we could buy him a meal. And I ended up writing my first story, The Highwayman who took the wrong fork in the road. I did a second one about 4 years later when he went to prison. When I wrote that first story, he had a criminal record that was 12 pages long. A lot of the stuff was penty-ante stuff, selling without a license. These guys were often harassed, especially in the 50s and the 60s. But some of it was serious too, assault and a lot of drug charges. So he ended up in prison near Orlando. The warden had read a couple of my stories, including a story about him, sought him out and said, here's some paints. Start painting. And Al Block painted the most, I can't think of the name of the story is in Seasons of Real Florida, but he painted Highwayman murals on the prison walls. They're beautiful. Some of them are 30 feet long. The warden was astounded that somebody could paint like that and paint so fast, but he was a highwayman. They did not spend weeks on a painting. They spent a couple of hours. Some of them used to lift weights, lift dumbbells with their painting hand to keep them strong. So the last highwayman painting I bought, and I think it was $800, was when Al got out of prison after 10 years. And I'm happy to say he's been out of prison for many years now, and now he makes some money with his paintings, but it's really been great to see. That's James Gibson. He was the most prolific of the painters. He passed away a couple of years ago. He once told me he thought there were 10,000 of his paintings out there. That's why I say you can go into places and find them. My wife's aunt in Pinellas County went to a garage sale. So they're in there and they see this painting. And she says, Aunt Jody says to Uncle Vinny, "This looks like one of Jeff's paintings." And Vinny, this old Irishman, he says, "Oh, well, I know it, but it's $5." So she said, "Well, I'm going to get it anyway." And indeed, it was a Highwayman painting. So probably worth a few $100s. By the way, let me just go back to this one. Harold Newton, one of his paintings sold for $43,000 a couple of weeks ago at an auction in St. Pete. It was a one-of-a-kind. It was the bar where Alfred Hair was murdered. New York Times wrote about this a couple of weeks ago. New York Times has written several stories about the Highwaymen. They're in the Florida Artists Hall of Fame. Steven Spielberg has some of their paintings. They are exhibited all over the country. There's coffee table books, probably in the main library in town, including a book on Al Block's prison murals. So this was actually the last one I wrote. This is the only woman. She is just an amazing person. She's out of the mold of Marjorie Stoneman Douglas in her strength and her determination. So during her lifetime, Mary Ann has, and she's still alive, she has supported 6 children and grandchildren with her painting. In addition, she has cut lawns. She's done carpentry work on major buildings, and she, for a while, she was greasing gears under a drawbridge. When I tracked her down, maybe, I don't know, 6 or 7 years ago, in Fort Pierce, she had a street front church. She was the pastor of the street front church. Someone had donated an organ, and she taught herself to play. And she sang in this beautiful, raspy gospel voice. And even better than that for me was discovering that Mary Ann was selling paintings out of the back of her car, a highwayman tradition. She popped open that trunk and the smell of fresh paint came in and hit you in the face. So anyway, Mary Ann Carroll, there's a coffee table book about her out there too that you can probably find in the library. Here's another interesting woman, Joyce Valentine Brand. When I was a kid, we went to the beach and we would drive over the MacArthur Causeway. And if I looked to the right at a certain spot, I used to see this billboard. It was this moving billboard. And it was, it was a young Catholic boy. It was kind of racy. It showed this little girl, her bathing suit being pulled down by a dog. I'd glance at it, hoping my dad wouldn't catch me. So, many years passed, and about, 2010, someone says, that little girl who posed for that ad is alive. She lives in Ocala. Why don't you, she'd make a great story. So I called her up. The phone rings. She picks it up. I introduce myself, tell her, when I was a kid, I loved your blah, 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 blah. And there's this utter silence. And as Daryl knows, the worst thing that can happen to a reporter is just no reply on the phone. And finally, there's this big sigh. She says, you don't want to write about that. I said, of course I do. This ad, this is part of my childhood. It was like a Mickey Mouse baseball card. I want to write about it. She says, oh, no, don't write about that. Write about my mother. And I thought, I have a mother. I love mothers, but why should I write about her? Does your mother write poetry where she rhymes moon with spoon? I just don't know. Is she another cat person, She says, oh, no. She said, my mother is an artist and you'll get a real kick out of her. So that's how I went. I went to work to Ocala and I met Joyce Valentine Brand. And talk about how shall I put this while I stand in a Methodist church? She was a hot chick. So in her early days, she had been one of the premier cheesecake calendar artists in the world, out of Chicago, big agency, the Gilbrand Agency, and that's her. She was very attractive. Sorry for you guys in back, I'll just have to tell you that she used to use herself as a model. So, in the 50s, Coppertone came to her, and she had done a bunch of commercial. She was a commercial artist. She'd done ads for diapers, different products, and they said, we have this ad already done. It was done by somebody in Miami. It's in black and white. It's a little bit crude. We would like you, a professional, to make it better. So that's when she did the Coppertone ad that all of us know. However, she was not particularly proud of that. That wasn't one of her greatest hits, because it was somebody else's idea. She was much prouder of the cheesecake calendars that I'm sure some of you, when you visited your mechanic, probably saw those in the garage. But anyway, so this was the ad. Don't be a pale face. Oh, even now the goosebumps. So there that's what she looked like when I met her, with the pink sunglasses and drinking a martini at 1 in the afternoon, and encouraged me to join in, I wasn't sure I was going to escape, if I was going to escape with my honor, What would I tell poor Susan, who's already upset about me being the founder of the Boys Without Date, if I said, well, I met the hot Coppertone artist. When I blow this photo up like this, she's got 3 paintings of clowns behind her that she had done for friends. I noticed the one on the right, there's a male clown and a female clown, and that male clown seems to be touching the female clown's butt. So this is what Joyce was like. She passed a couple of years ago, I'm sorry to say, but she was something. Didn't I have the world's greatest job, really? Somebody had to do this, right? So a lot of people say this, my profile on Nathan Martin was the best I ever did. I don't know if that's true, but it was one of my favorite ones, and I did it in right before I retired. Won some national awards. I was pleased, and the story about Nathan started when somebody who was a teacher in St. Petersburg called me up and said, "Hey, I just bought a piece of property in Gilchrist County. That's the county that's west of Gainesville. It's very rural. It's mostly lumber, timber." And my friend had just bought a piece of land there, and he was wandering around the woods one day and ran into this character who was barefooted, who had a shirt that looked like it had been torn apart by wild animals. And they started to talk, and this guy realized, man, this is an interesting guy. This is a Klink story if there ever was one. And so he told me about Nathan, gave me a phone number, and I called, tried to reach him for about a year off and on. Never could get him until I called one time at 5 in the morning. And he answered. He said, "Jeff, I've heard of you. Sure, you come on up. I'll spend as much time as you want." So I went up there. So he lived in this little, I'd call it a Crocker house that his daddy and his granddaddy had lived in. He was, I want to say, 6th generation Floridian. No running water. Did have one light bulb, but of course he had his cell phone. Pot-bellied stove for cooking and heating. And the thing about it was he had money. He had worked for the roads department for 3 decades. He just chose he wasn't going to spend it foolishly. So I heard he was very smart, 8th grade education, went into the house and noticed he was reading the personal memoirs of U.S. Grant, the Civil War general who later became president. And people who read histories will tell you that is one of the best. Grant was literate. It was literature he was writing. And it's not a book that you read while watching Seinfeld and eating cheese doodles. It's a serious book. It requires some effort and thinking. And this 8th grade dropout was reading it. And we started to talk about the Civil War, and he realized right away that I knew much less than he did. And he finally said, "Well, Jeff," he said, "let's talk about World War II now. You might do a little better." So we did. So that was the first of 6 visits, and I just realized this guy has a lot of depth. And here he's wearing shoes. most of the time when it's warmer, he doesn't wear shoes. He's got 2 pairs. One he bought at Walmart 25 years ago. Another pair that he climbed into a dumpster and got. And, when I first went up there, when I first heard about this guy living in the woods not wearing shoes, that was going to be enough for me. I was going to write about that, because if you grew up in Florida, when I did, most kids didn't wear shoes, except for church or school. I mean, how we didn't get tetanus, I don't know, because I stepped on nails like every 3 days. Would never mention it to my parents, If, by the way, if I start to foam at the mouth, please take care of me. But anyway, so it was going to be the bare feet. And then I start to realize that this guy, there's so much more to him, and he knows things that I certainly don't know, because it becomes clear that he has all these life skills that people like me, city boys, don't have. He can hunt. I can fish, but he can fish better. He can slaughter a hog. He can build a house. He can do plumbing. He can put on a roof. He can build an amazing garden if he wants. I don't have that. And I thought, well, gosh, what else can I learn? And one of the things I learned was he was a Thoreauvian character, as in Henry David Thoreau, who wrote, simplify, simplify, simplify. I can't simplify, man. I got, my iPhone is in my pocket, talking to me as we speak, I want all the gadgets, I want to go home and look at my big screen TV. Not him. He decided what was important and what wasn't. He knew who he was. So, I kept going, and I had a photographer who also took video. And every time I went, there was just something, a new little wrinkle. One time I stopped in Bell, the nearest town, about 10 miles away. I buy us both cups of McDonald's coffee. Brought it back, gave it to Nathan. He says, "Mom," he says, "that's really good coffee." He'd never been to a McDonald's before. He had never been to Miami. He'd never been to Orlando. It's the 21st century, right? So, and by the way, can you see his jacket? 25 years ago is when he got it brand new. The first or second day he was wearing it, he tried to free a bobcat kitten from a fence, and it clawed that shirt like that, but it was comfortable, and it has memories, and it has no buttons. He's got safety pins. That's Nathan's shirt, but we were in the nearest cemetery in the middle of the woods, and his family was in there. And we could go to each one of those graves. And he could tell me something about his great-great-granddad and his great-granddad and his dad and his brothers and whatever, and what he'd learned from them, and where they had been good, where they had failed, whatever. Anyway, Nathan. So, much to my surprise, I found out he'd been married twice. So the first time when he was 16, and when he was 19, she said, "Nathan, you're too country." Broke his heart. He went a little wild. But, it came to his senses. And one day he got a call from this woman who he'd known as a little girl. And she was very attractive, and Nathan was a hunk when he was young, like Tarzan, built like this. And she was divorced too, and she said, and she's a forceful woman. She said, "Nathan, why don't we get together for coffee?" So I don't think he wore that shirt, and I'm pretty sure he got his shoes out of the dumpster, and they went out, and they eventually got married. So they've been married a long time. I would call her a refined Southern Christian woman. She lives in this ranch house on about 5 acres of property. It's beautiful. She's got air. She's got TV. She's never been to his house. She's been to the house. She's never been inside. In the winter, she'll go there and they'll have a picnic, but she's never been inside. They have a weekend marriage. So he invited me for dinner one day. Dinner in the South is lunch. Supper is dinner. So we went over there for dinner, and Vida just made this amazing meal of 3 different kinds of meats and all these amazing vegetables from Nathan's garden. It was an amazing garden, I have to say. And he told me he planted by the moon. Like these old-time, these 19th century people planted. So when the moon is up, that's when you plant crops that grow up. When the moon is down on the other side of the earth, you put your root crops. And sounds like superstition, right? But I'm thinking, but I'm looking at this garden. I've never seen a garden this good. So anyway, we had a wonderful dinner. And then they sat down on the couch, and they sort of fenced, like old married couples do, trying to figure, well, who asked who to get married? And, well, I had to ask you, said Vida. No, ma'am, I recollect it was me. It was very funny. And she looked, he was wearing this, and she said, if you leave this here, I'm going to burn it. And she said, oh, no, ma'am, this is my favorite jacket. So, Nathan's nest. So I said, Vida, do Nathan's feet ever get to you? And she says, every once in a while they do. And I just get my rose clippers and clip his toenails. And I thought, it's not exactly a Valentine's Day card, but it's love anyway, So I was very sorry to hear this summer that Nathan had passed. He was in his 70s. He had some kind of blood disorder. It wasn't leukemia. I can't right now remember what took him. He was ready to go. I've always stayed in touch with him, and then Vida. And Vida said he was ready to go, so it made it a little bit easier. Vida has come to about 3 or 4 of my talks. She's not here tonight, otherwise she would have come up to me. I have to say, she should be my agent. She's bought 50 copies of my books, and she's given them to all her friends and people at the church, and whenever I talk, she brings more friends, and it's just a pleasure to see her. And then I'll answer some questions. Now, let me ask you this first. Have any of you ever read a Florida author by the name of Hiaasen? Yes. You have. So Carl writes satires. Carl's a South Florida writer, works for the Miami Herald, but he's been writing these best-selling satires since 1986. And they're very funny, and they're brilliant. Often people who do bad things to the environment suffer the consequences. I'll put it that way. Carl is Tim Chapman's best friend. And I have to say, when I was in junior college, Miami-Dade Junior College North, I was a sports editor. This was about 1968 or so. And one day this big guy, probably weighed 230 then, dressed in camouflage, head to toe, came into the office, got a little too close to me. He seemed a little menacing to me. And he said, I want to write about hunting and fishing. And I think he just thought, okay, this sissy boy is going to be revolted by this. But he didn't know I was, a boy without a date. So I said, sure. So my joke is, during the age of Aquarius, our newspaper had the only outdoors writer in the country. That was Tim. Tim ended up working at the Miami Herald for 40 years as a photographer. He was their macho photographer. Hurricanes, earthquakes, wars, revolutions, Tim would go. Always prepared, always had weapons. I mean, he was just kind of a life force and slightly dangerous. When he was 19, his dad said to him, "Tim, I'm going to send you up to Canada this summer. Stay with your grandmother." Why? Well, he wasn't evading the draft. He'd been using a chainsaw to cut down billboards advertising developments in Miami. The cops were looking for him. So, nevertheless, he and Carl Hiaasen, who writes environmental novels, became close friends and worked together on some stories. So Tim called me up. There's probably, 2009, 2010, and we kept in touch over the years. And he told me he'd been building this house in the Keys for 20 years and doing all the work himself. This guy like Nathan could do anything. He was building a house that could withstand, he told me, a Category 10 hurricane. He covered so many hurricanes that he had always paid attention to what withstood the winds and what didn't. And so that's the house he was going to build. It was almost done and he wanted me to go. And of course I did. And then I thought, you know what, nobody's ever written a profile of Tim, and it's going to be me. And I'm going to collect all these stories, including, one of his claims to fame is his boots were the first on the ground at Jonestown. The suicide, you've seen his photographs. Came rappelling down, wore a bandana, and just looked through the lens finder just so he could stay a little detached from the horror in front of him. So he built this house with 16-inch walls, bridge quality pilings, 16-inch roofs full of rebar. If Monroe County has the highest hurricane standards in the country, if they required 10 nails per square foot, he did like 100. Cisterns, solar panels. He put a safe room in the middle, no windows. He made it out of cedar. He went to Kentucky, which is where his family is from. There was a cedar farm, and he chopped a couple trees down. Came back a year later ran a portable sawmill and milled his own lumber, which Tim would do. Brought it down and built this very nice smelling room, but again, full of little holes for guns and stuff, He's a little bit of a wild man. Carl says he's crazy, but Carl loves him anyway. They're fishing buddies. Carl told me a story when I was writing this story. Tim had this dog. I think the dog's name was Bullet. That's what Tim would name his dog, right? Bullet. So Bullet kept digging under the fence and getting out in traffic in Miami. This was before Tim had built this house in the Keys. And Tim was afraid that Bullet was going to get hit by a car. And he asked a friend, "What should I do?" And this guy said, "Well, you know what you got to do. You're not going to like this, but you have to get a shock collar and put it on Bullet. And whenever Bullet goes to the fence, give him a little jolt." So Tim bought the shock collar, but then, of course, decided to try it on himself first and knocked him on his butt. And interestingly, a year or so later, I want to think Carl's novel is called Stormy Weather. There's this idiot from out of state who's driving through the Miami area, hardest hit by Hurricane Andrew, and taking video so when he gets back north he can show his friends, look at this carnage, look at these poor people. So Carl's most famous character, some of you know him as Skink. Skink is the former, and this of course is fiction, these are novels, Skink is the former governor of the state of Florida who went insane in Tallahassee from the corruption and the venality and the craven people he was meeting, and he flees to the Everglades and eats roadkill. And he emerges in I'd say every one of Carl's novels to discipline a bad guy. And in stormy weather, Skink puts a radio collar on this idiot who's shooting video, and every time he says something dumb, gives him a shock. So, next time you're reading one of Carl's novels and Skink is there, think Tim. Tim is the model, at least, for the scary skink, for the dangerous skink. I have no more loyal friend than Tim. I would never call on that loyalty for fear of what he might do. Because he's just, he takes no prisoners, I'll put it that way. So, always has a cigar in his hand. This is one of his last days at the Miami Herald. They would just send him out every day to find his own story, and he'd shoot a photograph, and he'd write a long caption, and it would be in the paper the next day. There's Tim's house. So, listen to this. So, the summer of 2017, Hurricane Irma is coming through the Gulf, and it's going to hit the Keys as a Category 4, maybe a 5. Tim, just by coincidence, he's in Wales. He's on vacation. So he texts me. He says, he's heard that Irma has just devastated the Keys. He said, I have no idea what happened to my house. He said, I wonder if you could call somebody at the Miami Herald. They must have photographers down there, ask them to swing by my house, give them my address, and I did that. And so I saw that photograph of Tim's post-Hurricane Irma house, and it was like nothing had happened. Everywhere around, I mean, the trees are down, roofs are gone, his house still standing. So I wrote that story, and Tim retired a year or so, actually about 5 years later. Miami Herald gave him a huge send-off with stories and a couple pages of his famous photographs. And I got a call from a reporter who had worked for Reuters. She didn't know Tim well, but she had a story that, God, I wish I could have put in my newspaper story, and the story that's in Alligators and B-Flat. So there's in Haiti, there's a dictator named Papadoc Duvalier, and there was an attempt to overthrow him. So there were a couple of weeks of chaos in Haiti, and Papadoc won. He wasn't overthrown. But all these reporters from all over the world are there, including Tim has taken pictures, and this Reuters reporter that Tim didn't even know is there too. So it's over, everybody's trying to leave, including Haitians who are afraid they're going to be killed by Papadoc because they were hoping that he was going to be deposed. But this reporter, a woman, who said she's 4'11", and she told me that because she wanted for me to imagine the difference in height, because Tim is I don't know, 6'3", but he just seems bigger because he's big, right? So they're standing in line in Port-au-Prince in the airport, and she's in front of Tim, he's behind her, and it's chaos. People are jumping on counters, screaming, begging to get on flights and stuff, and somebody crashes the line in front of them. So next thing you know, Tim reaches into his pocket, comes up with a switchblade, and then puts the flat of the blade on this guy's cheek and said, "Which ear would you like me to cut off?" The answer was, "Don't worry, I'm leaving." But it wasn't a surprise to me because of a story I did get in my essay about Tim. So he's driving across the Everglades one day, Miami Trail, the Tampa to Miami road crosses the Everglades, US 41. Tim's in his truck, and he sees somebody ahead of him veer out of his lane to run over a snake. So Tim slows down, opens his door, picks up the snake, and then hits the gas. And it takes him about 20 minutes, catches this guy in the outskirt of Miami, and jumps out of his truck, Tim does, and runs to the window of this car, knocks on it, the guy rolls down the window, and Tim says, "Here, eat it. We eat what we kill in Florida." So, Tim, like a lot of environmentalists, Tim has declared war on invasive species, from pythons to Nile monitor lizards to, of course, iguanas, which are just changing the face of South Florida. So Tim has a pellet gun, and whenever he sees one, he shoots it, sends me a picture. And when I saw this one, I knew what Tim was going to have for dinner, because he eats what he kills. So that's Tim Chapman. Any questions? I could go on, but I know that some of you have the really exciting parties to go to after this. But any questions?